And welcome back to the Standard Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm your host, Jono,
And I'm your host, Chris.
and we're here to bring you down a little breakdown post fantasy football season. There may be some of you out that are still playing fantasy football in the playoffs. Not for me, it's not my cup of tea. That being said, daily and other things and sports betting, way different than that. But today we're going to focus on who were the fantasy studs this season. This episode is going to be all about who our big winners were and who our fantasy MVPs were. So let's jump into it. All right, so we're going to jump down. We're going to each talk about the positional players here from your main studs, your QBs, running backs, wide receivers, tight ends. We're not going to get into defenses and kickers here because most people stream them anyway. But that being said, let's kick off with who our studs for fantasy were this season. People who were slept on in drafts or forgotten about in drafts that ended up being top 10 in their position and questionably league winners if you had them on your championship team. So, Chris, who was your quarterback? Who was your stud?
Yeah, I mean, you gotta start with Dak Prescott, right? Where he was going in the preseason rankings was eighth or ninth round. People were sleeping on him. People were saying he didn't have it with this offense. They weren't going to do it. The guy threw for 4,500 yards, 4,516 yards, 36 touchdowns, only 9 interceptions. And on top of that he had 242 yards rushing and 2 touchdowns. I mean, that's not too much. His rushing upside wasn't there. But I mean, when you have a guy like CeeDee Lamb who had the season that he had, you got to attribute that to the quarterback too. And look at Jake Ferguson, a top 10 tight end, CeeDee Lamb, the number 1 wide receiver overall for fantasy. And so even for 6-point touchdowns, passing touchdowns, he was only second to Josh Allen. You had guys like Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson, Patrick Mahomes all go over him. And the question is why? Like, look at the weapons that he had in the preseason. And this guy that slipped in the draft round after round after round. I mean, he wasn't like a 5th rounder. This guy was going after the 7th round. And he ends up being the number 2 quarterback overall, beating out Jalen Hurts, beating out Jordan Love, beating out Lamar Jackson, beating out Patrick Mahomes, but 7 other people did that. So it just goes to show that there's always value at the quarterback position later in the draft. And if you are going to go and reach on a guy in the top 3 rounds at the quarterback, it is risky. I mean, the guys that went, we talk about Justin Fields going in the top 4 rounds and Lamar Jackson. Lamar was the number 5 quarterback in the season.
Yeah.
And he was probably the number 2 quarterback off the board. Josh Allen finished number 1, right? So he was going in the first couple of rounds. He was worth it.
He
right?
went at his ADP. He went and
he went at his ADP. But Dak Prescott
Herbert,
for me,
you look at Herbert, you look at Mahomes, like you said, Lamar Jackson, Burrow with the injury. Like, injuries aside, with Herbert,
injuries
Burrow,
aside,
they still weren't.
Dak still had a
par.
great season.
Correct.
Yeah.
I still think he would have beat them out regardless.
Yeah. So who would you have a quarterback?
So I'm going to go with Mr. Irrelevant himself. I mean, it was almost
not irrelevant anymore.
Well, it was almost like we were picking him as Mr. Irrelevant in our fantasy drafts this year. How he finished the season, I get it. He had the elbow injury, and people were scared about that. But that's usually why you draft 2 quarterbacks and you back up your investment there. But he finished as the QB6. Guy threw for just under 4,300 yards and 31 touchdowns. Only had 11 picks. He had a couple tough games there. Against some good defenses, but against some good defenses, he also blew out the Cowboys for 34 points. The beauty of Purdy and why I want people to think about him going into next year is he is all about players with yak. I mean, outside of that, we just showed wide receiver number 1, Brandon Ayuk, why he can do what he does in terms of average depth of target, his air yardage, everything there for Ayuk was great. But we expected that leap, that jump here with a good passer, somebody who could push the ball downfield, not like Jimmy G. And we got exactly what we were asking for if you drafted Brandon Ayuk. Both Chris and I talked in the preseason. Ayuk was our number 1 guy over Deebo Samuel because Deebo to me was hot and cold, and he showed it again this year. Very cold, then became on hot late in the season when they needed him to. And so to me, the fact that you have Deebo Samuel, you have George Kittle, you've got Christian McCaffrey, get the ball in these three guys' hands, and their yards after the catch are exactly what you're looking for. These guys
Well, look,
get it
you
and
had
take it.
and this is the argument for drafting Purdy much higher than where he should be going anyway. Is you have the number one running back by a long shot.
Mm-hmm.
You have two of the top 10 wide receivers for fantasy finishes, and you have the number 2 tight end for fantasy finish. So
now you got to put an asterisk next to Debo because of his rushing yardage, and that it comes into that for wide receiver. If you look at his receiving stats alone,
yeah, but he still had 7
still,
rushing, or he still had 7 receiving touchdowns.
Correct. Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. It's yak for him. Like you got to like that there.
Sure. I mean, again, you still have all these weapons around him, so it's a guy you can literally throw a screen to, and he can take it to the house.
Yep.
So, I mean, you have 4 legitimate weapons there that are elite at their position. Why would you not like the quarterback that's throwing them the football? And I get it. You know, McCaffrey can have 4 touchdowns in the game, 4 rushing touchdowns in a game.
Debo can run a couple in the red zone.
Yeah, you're going to have those, but for the most part, I mean, how many games did Purdy have multiple touchdowns this year? You know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 games where he had multiple touchdowns this year, including 3 games with 4 touchdowns passing. Yeah, you gotta love that production that you're getting out of that position from him, and for a guy that you drafted 9th round, 10th round, maybe. If not later.
If that, because Aaron Rodgers was going earlier than him. Dak was going earlier than him. Those guys were going in the 8th, 9th, 10th rounds. This guy could have been picked up in your league in the 12th round, and it's a steal of a lifetime there, especially if you – this is one of those situations where I think I did a very good job in my draft. I went ahead and I grabbed Justin Fields in the potential there, but I backed it up with Kirk Cousins. Now, I could be sitting here talking about Kirk Cousins if he never got hurt because his season was on fire. And he could have put up the same. In fact, he was leading the league pretty much almost until his injury. So, but the fact is, I could have went Purdy and been just as happy because the whole Fields debacle, this would have saved somebody's season here. Yeah, and I think that's the biggest thing is like this guy should have been drafted in every single league, and he wasn't, and he ends up being a big winner for you at the QB position. Let's move over to the running back positions. I'll start off with my running back stud here, and it was a guy that I mistakenly did not keep on my lineup as a keeper. I decided to stick with Dameon Pierce as a keeper and instead dropped back to the pool James Conner. And James Conner decides he's going to have his first 1,000-yard season of his career, and he did it in 13 games.
Yeah.
Just think about that. 13 games, he had 1,000 yards. He was the RB15 in standard scoring, 18 in PPR. He only had 7 total touchdowns rushing, but again, we talk about it. He only played 13 games.
What I would say for
9 total touchdowns in 13
what
games.
I would say for him is he was probably the fantasy playoff running back MVP.
Yeah, definitely that.
I mean, he made my run to the championship. You know, I couldn't win there, but he made my run to the championship. Having him on my team, and
but this is the reason why I think he's all season though, not just the MVP. Like, from 13 to 18, he was no lower than RB11, and he was RB4, 11, 7, 2, and 2. But even like the game before that, when he came back, he only played 42% of the snaps, and it was RB50 against a tough Rams defense. That was his. The 3 games before that were tough, but even then, when you look at the first 4 games of the season before he got injured in the 5th game, he was RB28 in the first game against Washington. He was RB11, then RB6, and then RB31 against a tough San Fran defense. But he averaged no less than 4.4 yards per carry in those 4 games. In fact, he only had 1 game, even including the ones where he left earlier, only played partial, where he was less than 4 yards per carry, and that was against Chicago, where he was still RB7. He had a 3.75 yards per carry, but ended up putting 67 yards through the air and a touchdown. The guy played out of his mind for his age on top of that, which is why I put him as an MVP for me, because he was down there. He was somebody that, the guy could put up a lot of touchdown capital. He did it a couple years ago, had 15 touchdowns. You know, what can we get from him this season? Because in 2022, when you looked at his totals, it was pretty good. He ended up with, I believe, 3, 6, 7 rushing touchdowns as well. had a bunch of top finishes towards the end of the season, et cetera, et cetera. And his schedule was easy. Again, he was playing for the Cardinals without a number one quarterback for them to start the season. So I get why people faded on him. But man, oh man, if you drafted him and you stuck through it, or if you're somebody that saw the value and traded for him mid-season or while he was injured, he won you your league or at least got you to that championship if you had the rest of the pieces there.
Yeah, oh, for sure. I mean, so for running back for me, it's got to be Kyren Williams. This guy was being undrafted or 14th, 15th round. We go into the season thinking Cam Akers was going to be the guy there. And Cam Akers across the board on the consensus was, that he was going to be, he's the safe 0 RB play, right?
It was Montgomery and him right next to each other.
It's Cam Akers.
And was it Connor, Montgomery, and him were the three that they
And Kyren Williams came in from game one and just took control this season. He's probably the waiver wire pickup of the year, if not Puka. I mean, it's Kyren Williams.
Yeah, and I'll give you that.
And I know he was available in a lot of leagues, going into week 2 after week 1. Let's just put this into perspective. He missed 4 games this year. All right. He only had 2 games where he had under 10 points in fantasy. Most of his games, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He had 5 20-plus point performances. The guy ran for 1,144 yards, 12 touchdowns, added another 206 yards receiving, and 3 touchdowns. In 12 games? Just absolutely ridiculous. Just absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, he was unbelievable, and the way he ran the ball was fresh. I'm just going to go out there and say that going into next season, he's obviously going to be the guy that people want there, but I'm afraid to draft any running back from McVay because it goes all the way back to the Todd Gurley days.
I don't know.
Trust me, Gurley was the guy to get, obviously, and McVay had Gurley, and the first year with McVay and Gurley, they were phenomenal. But then you have the second year with McVay and him
back again. I mean, you have to protect against the receivers, and it opens so many holes for him. Like everyone thought going into this year that the Rams were going to be in a rebuild mode. Everyone. And here they are
based on last year. How quickly we forget 2 years ago they were Super Bowl champs.
Yeah, and here they are going into the playoffs as a contender, a really hot contender. Kyren Williams is a guy that he's one of the few running backs that averaged over 5 yards per carry this season. Mm-hmm. And to think that he had, let me look. He had 228 attempts, and he still averaged over 5 yards a carry. Like that's crazy. I mean, most of the guys that are getting those attempts are getting 3.5, 4 yards a carry. I mean,
Joe Mixon.
Every game, every game he was in, he was dominant in, and he was responsible for a lot of fantasy championships this season. I mean, throwing up, he didn't play in the last week of the season, but in championship week, throwing up 28 points. 3 touchdowns in championship week. He kept going off week in and week out. He was guaranteed a touchdown almost every week. 1, 2, 3. There's only 4 games that he played in that he didn't score.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of him. Again, you said it. You hit the nail on the head with Puka and him being the 2 biggest waiver wire pickups.
Thing is 3 games. He only didn't score in 3 games that he played in.
So I'm with you on Kyren. He's going to be a guy who's probably going he could be a first rounder next year in some ADP, especially in standard scoring with the amount of touchdown capital he has and how good he ran the ball. He's somebody that's going to be drafted above your Jonathan Taylors, possibly above your Josh Jacobs. I know it's a little bit early. We will be getting into our mock drafts as we get closer towards the NFL draft period. But these are things to think about going your season. Especially if you're in a league that all of a sudden where your draft pick is because of where your finish is, you can start planning your stuff here and start targeting a guy like this because, people are going to be going for him too, but he's going to be going against some of the big names that we have been drafting in the past because of his opportunities that he has here. And they really,
at this point, you need to put him up above Eckler. You need to put him above Pollard. You need to put him above Henry.
Yep.
I mean, the only other guy in
Jacobs.
there, maybe.
I think you put him up Jacobs because who knows if Jacobs even returns.
Well, I mean, I say he's in that conversation with like Jonathan Taylor, and Josh Jacobs. Like Kyron is right
and
there.
Saquon and Saquon.
And Saquon. Well, depending on where Saquon goes, because he's not going to be a Giant.
He'll be a Giant.
He's not going to be a Giant.
Yeah, we'll talk about it another time. They would have traded him.
Let's move on. Let's move on to wide receivers.
Well, before we jump into the wide receivers, don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that notification button. Every week, we're going to still be dropping content here. Next week, we'll be dropping our nice little episode on our least valuable players and our duds
LVPs.
of the season. LVPs and duds of the season. And also, following this episode this afternoon, I will be dropping my episode describing my Super Bowl playoff tradition, where I've been doing it for over a decade now, and it is our Super Food Bowl. And so every year I cook
food
bracket. The two teams in the Super Bowl is the food I cook and the beer I drink, cities and states that they're from. So I'll give you what I'm doing, give you guys an idea, and maybe you guys want to adopt a fun tradition. Who knows? But let's jump in. Who's your wide receiver?
Wide receiver has to be Nico Collins. This is a guy I was on in the preseason. This was a guy after last season that I said he is being criminally underdrafted. I mean, he went undrafted this year. I remember putting out a short this year. We did a video on it in the preseason, talking about how he was being undrafted in most leagues.
I'm kicking myself because he was undrafted in ours. I went for the second defense and not him. Kicking myself.
And this guy, all he did this year was finish as wide receiver 9. He had 1,297 yards and 8 touchdowns.
Jeez.
He absolutely went bananas down the stretch. I mean, he had multiple games over 140 yards. He had a 191-yard game with a touchdown, 168-yard game with 2 touchdowns. I mean, the last week of the season goes for 195 in a must-win game. I mean, I think his numbers towards the end of the season were inflated a little bit just because Tank Dell went down. But still before that, I mean, he was on fire for most of the season. There were 2 weeks he didn't play in due to injury. But he was an absolute. I mean, this is a guy that you can say easily went drafted in either the 15th round or undrafted, and he finishes as a wide receiver 9. And I said this in the preseason. He is the number 1 wide receiver in Houston, and everyone thought that Houston was going to be this kind of, maybe they're going to be a rebuilding team. And on this channel,
they were going to be a run-heavy offense. That's what we expected it to be.
On this channel, we said, be careful, like CJ Stroud. And I was a CJ Stroud believer. I said CJ Stroud is going to be the best quarterback in this draft. And he is. And look what he's going to do. There's underrated weapons, between Tank Dell, between Nico Collins, between Dalton Schultz. Those guys came in and they made a huge difference. And none of them needed to be the guy. And even Nico Collins, only just over 1,200 yards, has 8 touchdowns, but he wasn't the guy there. Noah Brown had significant impact in the game. Tank Dell had significant impact in games. Devin Singletary had significant impact in games. So there was a lot of other people and a lot of other pieces that made differences on this team.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me for Nico Collins I believe this offense was going to be a run-heavy offense. I thought from the beginning they were so good on the ground last year. They struggled in the air. Even though they passed the ball a lot last year because they were down in games, they ran the ball a ton. And Dameon Pierce was supposed to be this comeback stud here season, have a fantastic year for them after a great rookie campaign, and we got none of that there. Now, obviously, Singletary backed up his role in that offense for having some good games. But, man, Nico Collins is that guy. He was the alpha. He belongs in that top 10 conversation going into next season as well.
He has to be. So, I mean, who is your wide receiver that you have as a fantasy stud this year?
My fantasy stud for wide receiver is Puka. You named him already, as in one of the waiver wire pickups, has to be the season winner for people there. And to me, Puka Nacua, he was undrafted in anything but dynasty leagues and rookie leagues because nobody had him on their radar, and neither did most NFL teams because of his injury history at BYU, and his numbers weren't great coming out of the combine. But man, did he take that X receiver role and just supplant himself as not only the best rookie to do it of all time in both receptions and yardage, but he put the entire NFL on watch. He was able to beat good cornerbacks. He was able to play against certain people and win on contested catches, beat people in routes. And he, even though he was not fast in terms of his downright combine speed, he played fast on the field, and it showed. Like, he made some acrobatic catches. This guy is going to be a wide receiver in this league for a long time.
I mean, he had 160 targets this season. Like, that's absolutely ridiculous. 160. He had 105 receptions, 1,486 yards, almost 1,500 yards as a rookie. You know, the touchdowns weren't great. It was only six touchdowns, but the yardage every week was there. And a lot of it was, you know, benefited from the early season with Cooper Kupp not being there. There had to be a rapport from another wide receiver there. And Puka had to step into that. But down the stretch, I mean, he continued to show that he is not just a Cooper Kupp replacement. He is the number two there, and if not the alpha there. But I wouldn't quite crown him as the alpha. But I mean, he took a lot of receptions. He got a lot of targets. Having Stafford really helped him.
Yeah, I think, to me, I could call him the number one guy there, because he plays the alpha X receiver role. Now, Cooper Kupp, it's a 1A, 1B situation, or 1A, 1A situation, but there's no way I could put him below Cooper Kupp, because rarely did he fade out of a game if it wasn't due to injury. Like, he was in every game. He was fighting through every game. He fought through injury, and Cooper Kupp faded in and out of games at times, but he has the explosiveness too. I mean, it's just having Matt Stafford throw you the ball and having a good running game going. It helped both these guys here, but right off the bat, you're missing your top receiver from the previous seasons for a couple games due to injury, and you get this young kid coming out of there doing what he's doing. I mean, it was better.
Let's just put this in perspective. The last week of the season, in week 18, was his lowest target number on the year, and it was 6.
Mm-hmm.
Every other game, he had 7 or more.
Yeah.
He's a volume play at best, and he has explosive ability beyond that.
Now, agreed. The thing you got to watch is, if Stafford's the quarterback there, you like him a lot. If there's a change at the helm there, we don't know. He still got targeted when Stafford was out for that one game. I will say that.
Yeah.
And I believe he had a touchdown. But going into that, the one thing I will say is, you look at the rookie seasons for Jamar Chase, you look at the rookie seasons for Justin Jefferson, and then you look at the rookie season for Puka Nacua, and he came out with a bang where those guys were slow climbs. And did Puka come out with a bang, and he held steady for the whole season. That's why he broke the rookie record.
Yeah, I mean, Jefferson had Thielen at the time coming, on the team, and whatever you want to say now, but Thielen was still a number one. The guy was scoring double-digit touchdowns. When Chase came in, T. Higgins was there,
so Tyler Boyd. But I guess no Cooper Kupp. But I'm just saying,
there was no Cooper Kupp. There was literally no one at receiver. Like, again, we came into the season thinking that the Rams were going to be in rebuild all year. They weren't.
No, you just haven't seen rookie play like that since, honestly, Randy Moss. When he came in the league.
But he's a different type of receiver. He's a possession type of receiver that has the explosive ability after the play.
Which is why I love him, and that's why.
I love him. He reminds me a lot of almost like Amon-Ra St. Brown, where like they're not this down the field explosive like Jamar Chase. He has those 80 targets in the season, 90 targets in a season. I mean, to go your rookie season and have 105 receptions, 160 targets. That's a volume guy. That means you're getting 10, 11 targets a game. And to be able to have 1,500 almost 1,500 yards on top of that means you're not only catching the short passes, but you're also able to break the big one.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about tight ends here. I'll start off with mine. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
You have one more note on Nacua?
No. I was going to say we might as well talk about the only tight end that we should really talk about here, who is the league winner.
I guess yes, the one you have, but
let's start with him. Let's just start with him.
Let's start with mine, because we'll finish.
All right.
With
we'll work our way up. Right.
I want to say this guy because I mentioned him in the preseason. I was on him in the preseason. I hyped him up during the season. If you watched our shows, Chris kept giving me a bunch of crap for him. Constantly, and I had him. He was a tight end, top 12 tight end finish last year. for me, and he was one of the guys I swapped back and forth. David Njoku. You look at what he did this year for the Browns. He had quarterback play that was iffy the entire time because there's no consistency, because you had issues with injuries back and forth, and you were getting PJ Walker, you were getting Deshaun Watson in there. You were getting, it didn't matter who you were getting, he was still getting targeted.
Dorian Thompson-Robinson.
There were 4 games, and he didn't play week 18. There were 4 games this season. It happened to be 4 out of the first 5 that he had 4 or less carries. After that, he never dipped below 7 targets. Never dipped below 7 targets on that offense. And that's with Amari Cooper. That's with Elijah Moore. That's with running backs out the backfield like Jerome Ford and Kareem Hunt. Once Flacco came in, his totals were unbelievable. He never went below 8 targets in a game there.
That's what I'll say is, like, really once Flacco came in and developed a rapport with him is really where he elevated, and the numbers right there for where he finished. Like, there were a lot of guys that were inconsistent, but you look at the last 4 weeks minus week 18, right? So week 14, 15, 16, and 17. I mean, he finished our tight end 2, tight end 2, tight end 6, tight end 3. I mean, he absolutely dominated in the fantasy playoffs as a tight end. And that's really where he made his money, because, like, I heckled you all season because, yeah, you're right, the targets were there, but, like, the yardage really wasn't there. He only had one double-digit game up until week 14, and then he goes on a tear of 4 straight weeks with double digits. So,
I mean, yes, I agree with you, but the fact of the matter, he had 5.6
targets. He had 15 targets in week 11 against Pittsburgh with 7 receptions and only had 5.6 points.
And he was tight end 9.
And he was tight end 9.
But that's the stake of the tight end position. It's what I'm saying.
I know.
When you finish tight end 5, yes, I agree. Like, he won people championships because weeks 14 through 17, where he was no less than tight end 6, and he was, other than that, he was tight end 2 or 3. He still was tight end 5, tight end 9. He consistently was between 12 and tight end 5 between weeks 7 through 12. And the first game with Flacco was where I thought he was going to be the best game. Was his worst game, arguably, since the first 3 games of the season. And so, to me, once him and Flacco got on board, it was better because he was still getting the high target volume, but he was getting the receptions out of it because he had a better passer throwing him the ball, getting him open. He had 200-yard games. He had a 91-yard game, multiple touchdowns. I mean, to me, going into next season, the athletic ability he has, he needs to be drafted as a top 7 tight end in this league, because even with some of the other guys around here, you never know. I mean, you saw what happened with Travis Kelce. You saw what happened. Like, obviously, Mark Andrews probably finishes in the top 10 and may bump him down to tight end 6. But you could find it very hard for me to argue the people that are below him that should be above him in this case. And that's why I like him. I think he's solidified his position for the Cleveland Browns, and his athleticism is just unbelievable. His yards after the catch, he had the most out of any tight end in the league.
Yeah, no, he was, again, late season heroics from him. But let's talk about full season heroics from, really a rookie number 1 tight end finish. This is the only tight end we should really be talking about in studs.
Well,
right?
We got to talk about one guy that I like, but I agree. This guy, if you give an MVP to a position, it's Sam Laporta.
It's Sam Laporta. Sam Laporta. I mean, the guy, 120 targets, 86 receptions, 889 yards, and the only tight end with double-digit touchdowns, with 10. He absolutely was. I mean, George Kittle finished number 2 with 138 points. Sam Laporta finished with 153. And we talk about the huge drop-off that's between, like, the top 1-2 tight ends and everyone else. And Sam Laporta was that this year. I mean, he absolutely dominated. He took over. He's the solid number 2 on that team. And that's the benefit that he has too, is, over TJ Hawkinson or some of these other guys, is that he is there's Amon-Ra St. Brown and the running game, but he's used as a number 2 receiver.
Yeah, and you got it. That's how TJ Hawkinson was. And so I don't know how people didn't. I mean, we talked about him in preseason, how we liked Laporta and we liked Kincaid, and how we made that bold prediction of two rookie tight ends finishing top 10 tight ends. Now, Kincaid didn't get the volume and opportunity that we expected him to, with Dawson Knox actually still having opportunity there, and Luke Musgrave got hurt towards the end of the season, but we proved it that one tight end could overtake multiple people and put themselves in the top 5.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably the deepest the tight end position's ever been. I mean, we see like this. Remember, we talked about this drastic fall off between like the top tight ends and then everyone else. I mean, you look at the top 10 tight ends and they're all over 100 points. Sam Laporta is at 150. Number 10 is Trey McBride at 100. So 153 to 100 is the top 10. It's a pretty good spread right there. So we have a deeper tight end position than we've ever had. And there were a lot of injuries to the tight end positions this year too. That would have, that could have propelled guys up into that 100-point range as well. So yeah, I mean, Mark Andrews finished the season at 90 points and he hasn't played for 8 weeks.
I know.
So you would have had 11 tight ends finish with over 100 fantasy points. I mean, Laporta is a guy that, again, he went really low drafted, probably in the 10th, 11th round. If you're in rookie drafts, you probably got a steal on him. He's in a great situation where they love to throw the ball to the tight end position. We saw that with TJ Hawkinson there before him. And we see that now with Sam Laporta as really a dynamic playmaker after the catch. So he's got to be the fantasy stud for this season at tight end.
Yep, I'm with you.
So let's talk about your fantasy overall MVP.
MVP. It's CeeDee Lamb.
Okay.
And the reason I say that is it's not a cop out picking a guy who's in the top 2 rounds ADP wise. It's the fact that everybody had all these other receivers way ahead of him. You had some leagues had AJ Brown ahead of him. You had Jamar Chase ahead of him. You had Justin Jefferson, rightfully so, and Tyreek Hill, rightfully so, ahead of him too as well. But this guy finished 50 yards behind Tyreek Hill this season, right? He finished with an unbelievable finish of the wide receiver 1 in the league. Not Tyreek Hill. He was a wide receiver 1 in standard and PPR to finish the league. 1749 in terms of his yardage. He had 12 total touchdowns, an uptick from last year. All his numbers increased this year. And
135 receptions.
Yeah,
that's he had 181 targets.
81 targets. But that's in due part, I was going to say, to Dak Prescott running less, throwing less interceptions, and plus the Cowboys offense, I mean, part of it is CeeDee Lamb, because their running game was terrible this year, is the fact that CeeDee Lamb and the Cowboys offense were the number 1 scoring offense, I think, in the NFL this year. But you look at his stats, it was a rough start in the first 6 games before the bye. Yeah, he had 11 points in week 6 against the Chargers. He had 10 against New England, 14 against the Jets on 143 yards. But he had 1 touchdown, 200-yard games, and that was it in the first 6 games. Then, come off that bye, the dude had 100 yards in all but 4 or 5 games in the rest of the season. From weeks 8 to 18, 5 games he missed 100 yards. And he scored in all but 2 of those games.
Yep.
All but 2. Actually, all but 3 because he ran one. All but 1 because he ran one in on one of the games he didn't have a receiving touchdown. That's how much of an impact this guy had on this team, on this offense. And you better believe they're going to pay Dak, and they're going to look to extend this guy and get him paid too as well. He's the future for the Cowboys. He's going to be a Cowboys Hall of Famer. To me, he was the MVP because if you were at the back of the draft, or if you took a chance of him a little bit earlier on, he ended up being who you wanted to be. He was equivalent to Tyreek Hill, and you didn't need to pay for him that high. He was he was better than Justin Jefferson. You had the injury to Jefferson, but probably would have been equivalent to, and you didn't have to pay for him that high. That's why he was the MVP to me, because from weeks 8 to 18, it was a lineup lock. He never went below double digits since week 6. And he only had 3 games a season that he was below double digits, and that's in standard scoring. In PPR, he was above double digits the entire season.
So, the same way you talked about James Conner kicking yourself and not keeping him, I'm kicking myself for not
I
keeping
knew
my.
this was going to be your MVP.
This is my MVP. Is not
It should be,
keeping
though.
Raheem Mostert.
Yep.
I had him in the 14th round last year, kept him all season long, and just decided I was like, I don't know if I can keep him at that pick. I wanted to keep another player, and I mean, he goes off and has an 18 touchdown or an 18 rushing touchdown season, 3 receiving, had 21 total touchdowns on the season. 21, unbelievable. I mean, say what you want about his rushing yards. I mean, his rushing yards weren't anything to write home about. He just broke over 1,000 yards, had 1,012 yards, had only 175 yards receiving, and but this is probably one of our most popular videos that we did was how the Dolphins running backs were being criminally underdrafted, and specifically talking about Raheem Mostert and Jeff Wilson. Because in the preseason rankings, everyone had Devon Achane going 2, 3, sometimes 4 rounds ahead of Raheem Mostert. And I told everyone to pump their brakes because Raheem Mostert was still there. He knows the system. He knows the Shanahan running style. They liked him enough to keep him around as a veteran presence. And all he did this year was score touchdowns. I mean, you talk about the CeeDee Lamb performances where, in the first 4 weeks, he doesn't score a touchdown. In the first 3 games, Raheem Mostert had 6 touchdowns. It wasn't until week 4 where he had his first game without a touchdown. And, he had 7 touchdowns in the first 3 weeks. He had a receiving touchdown in one of those games too. I mean, Devon Achane had his when he played too.
Yeah,
but Raheem Mostert
went
never.
off, and I think that's part of the reason why Mostert's yardage total was low, plus some injuries and games he missed. But you can't take away for the fact that this guy reminded me of Austin Eckler the past 2 seasons, reminded me of Todd Gurley in that one season with the Rams. Not quite to the LT level, but when he had the ball in his hands, he in the red zone, he was scoring. It didn't matter.
We talked about the earlier in this episode about Kyren Williams being on stud at the running back position. Raheem Mostert finished 2 spots ahead of him.
Yep.
Raheem Mostert finished 19 points ahead of him.
Well, that's why Kyren wouldn't be an MVP for you.
Yeah.
It's because the jump is just as big, but the higher finish.
Yeah. I mean, he was an absolute monster this year at the running back position. He was a plug and play. And there were so many times we had questions throughout the year where it's like, do I start Raheem Mostert? Yes, you start Raheem Mostert. Doesn't matter the matchup. Start Raheem Mostert. He was matchup proof. I mean, there was 3 games that he played this season where he finished with under 10 points. Buffalo in week 4, and Philadelphia in week 7. And then Las Vegas in week 11, where he had 9.3 points. Every other week this season, excluding 17 and 18 where he didn't play, every other week this season he had over 10 points.
And this is why I am kind of putting an edge on Dolphins over the Chiefs in tonight's game.
I know.
It's hard. It's tough to say that because of the weather and it's an away game, but Raheem Mostert has been playing out of his shoes, out of his cleats. Achane has been fantastic as a rookie. And in cold weather games, you can't beat the ground game, like ground games where it's at. And we talked about you and I talked about on the phone earlier. The last time the weather's been this cold was the Giants playoff game against the Packers when Giants went on to win the Super Bowl, and Brett Favre and the Packers played Eli Manning, and it was 130 yards on the ground.
Different running backs, though. It's different running backs.
Ahmad Bradshaw was
Brandon Jacobs and Ahmad Bradshaw are very different running backs. Raheem Mostert and Devon Achane.
I'm just saying, running game came to be the factor of that game.
Yeah.
So
I don't know.
Let's go back to Raheem Mostert, and the fact is, he is 31 years old. He's getting older. I'm sure they're gonna sign him back to another year contract next year. I think Jeff Wilson may be the odd man out in this backfield, but you never know.
I'm sure next year that Achane is going to be drafted in front of him too.
Yep, but I still think he's worth picking up. I still think he's worth having him in this lineup, and I think him and Achane can both exist in fantasy lineups as starters.
Yeah.
So those are our 2 MVPs, CeeDee Lamb, Raheem Mostert, and we went through our studs of the season here. Obviously, there's plenty more. A lot of players this year had fantastic outings.
we're not throwing CMC at you guys. That's the obvious pick, right?
Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
right.
But wait till we talk about our LVPs and our duds in next season. Some of them you guys can guess who they are, and some of them are just going to be based on our own opinions on where we thought they should have been drafted and where they were drafted in our minds, ADP wise, and where they ended up finishing. So don't forget to tune in for that. And again, like I told you, if you want to hear about a tradition and adopt a new tradition for your super food bowl and your food bracket, that episode should be dropping this afternoon in a couple hours here. As always, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.